before we get started with our speakers, there is one person I would like to introduce. Those of you who are 6-year veterans or who just went to the first year and are back now may remember that I gave a talk about how the San Jacinto Monument had been put in the wrong place, and that the actual turning point in the Texas Revolution came at Mrs. Powell's Tavern, where Generals Filasola and Urrea and Sesma and Gaona and the others got together and decided that they would head west instead of east. If they had headed east, Houston might have been toast. But they headed east instead. And I read many passages from the letters of General Urrea, and I won't give that speech again, but I just would remind you that General Jose Urrea is one of the most formidable figures in the Texas Revolution, certainly one of my favorite characters, and his great, is that enough? Granddaughter, Anita Urrea Cepeda, is here with us today from Port Arthur, originally born in Tucson, as I guess was General Urrea when it was part of Sonora. Would you just stand so that we can recognize your presence here today? The deeper you get into Texas history, and I get this all the time from Crockett's descendants, is that we're part of a kind of living web, and we think we're distant from this past. But history is just something all around you that you can't always see. And in the memories and in the family connections of many of us, we go back, and I know I'm talking to many of you in the room, we go right back in just a few generations to those folks who were contending in this part of the world in the 1830s and 40s. Our next two speakers are two of those people that Don Felix referred to this morning. You know, one is a rising star, one is a grand old man. Take your choice. I think it could go either way. Archie McDonald submitted an informal introduction as well as a formal introduction, and there's no way I could fail to convey to you his informal introduction as well as the formal. Archie, a child of the Depression, grew up in Beaumont, where he was graduated from French High School and Lamar Tech, moved on to the Rice Institute here in Houston, and finished off at LSU. In Beaumont, he also married above his station, and the poor bride has made the best of a bad bargain for nearly half a century. Archie has taught at Stephen F. Austin State University in Nacogdoches since Stephen himself was a student. He has written some books and made some speeches, but none of it has ever amounted to much. Archie does not plan to retire. Instead, he will just quit working one day and not tell anyone, so they will keep the paychecks coming. This may, in fact, have happened already. He has indeed taught at Stephen F. Austin State for more than 42 years. He has been since 1971 the director of the East Texas Historical Association and editor of the association's journal. That makes 35 years, in case your math is bad. He is a member and past president of the Nacogdoches Rotary Club, a past president of the Texas State Historical Association, and past vice chair of the Texas Historical Commission. And he has written more than a dozen books, edited more than a dozen more. I must tell you that among his books, my favorite is Travis, his biography of William Barrett Travis, and among the edited volumes, the wonderful diary of Adolphus Stern. You can learn a lot about Texas by reading Hurrah for Texas, the diary of Adolphus Stern, reprinted recently as 1986 by the Aiken Press. Archie is going to be telling us about what has been his part of the world for the past 40 years, East Texas, and what was going on in East Texas during the Texas Revolution. Goodness knows, Nacogdoches is where there was a place of complex and split loyalties. as the revolution was approaching in 1835 and broke out in that year. Andrés Resendez knows something about complex and split loyalties. I just reviewed for a British publication last year his marvelous new book, Changing National Identities at the Frontier, Texas and New Mexico, 1800 to 1850, published by the Cambridge University Press, and the winner this year of the Coral Tullis Award for the best book on Texas history in 2005, given by the Texas State Historical Association. I first ran across Andres at a TSHA meeting, I guess, sometime in the mid-90s when he was very young. I was too. And his publications have been building and building on the work that he did at the University of Chicago, where he pursued his PhD in history in the 1990s, as well as getting a Master's of Arts there. He received his Bachelor of Arts in International Relations at the Colegio de Mexico. You may remember we had a faculty member from the Colegio de Mexico here in our second annual San Jacinto Symposium in the person of Josefina Zoraida Vasquez. He says they chat, they don't always agree, but they agree more than they disagree. And Archie is going to be telling us about what was going on in East Texas during the Revolution, and Andres is going to be telling us about just who these Texans were. And that gets very complicated as they try to define themselves among all these split and complex loyalties. So let me turn over the lectern first to Professor Archie McDonald.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you for inviting me and allowing me to be here with you today. I extend especially my compliments to all those on the panel whom I heard this morning. I learned from each one of them. I've recruited an article for my journal from one of them, so it's been a very profitable occasion for me. I think I had a different kind of introduction with which I intended to begin, but I think instead, and I'll get to that in a moment, I'm going to begin by presenting to you a script version of my radio commentary. For the last 5 years, I've done radio commentary that airs through the NPR affiliate Red River Radio, and being the occasion that yesterday was, I prepared this one especially to acquaint people who are not Texans with what date the significance of that date. So I'm going to start with that, with your permission. Texans everywhere, and some do complain that Texans are everywhere, will look a little red, white, and bluer today, the 170th anniversary of the Battle of San Jacinto, while non-Texans will wonder what the fuss is about. Mentioning that engagement to Vermonters or Kansans will not trigger as much response as Gettysburg or the Bulge or Iwo Jima, but it has meaning to those ubiquitous Texans. Winning at San Jacinto allowed upstart rebels to establish their republic, led to a war that expanded the United States to the Pacific, and laid a log on smoldering American sectionalism that eventually combusted into a terrible civil war. Quite a lot for a battle that lasted less than 20 minutes. Like those Vermonters and Kansans, likely they have at least heard of the Alamo, since Hollywood has produced more than 20 films depicting the Texians' primary loss during the revolution against Mexico. Since my movie tastes are peculiar, one of my favorites, Viva Max, features a comic recapturing of the Alamo in the 1960s by a Mexican patrol led by a General Max, an inept leader without much skill or purpose, but who nonetheless found personal and national honor once again among those fortress walls. Even that warped interpretation makes it easy to remember the Alamo. San Jacinto has not attracted Hollywood's attention, as has the Alamo, Perhaps there is more romance in the memory of every Texan dying in defense of their fortress and whatever ideals each of us wishes to presume motivated them, and in a larger battle in which so few Texans were killed or wounded, even though this time they won. Maybe to others, San Jacinto seems anticlimactic. We know the rest of the story, that the Texans, led by Sam Houston, defeated and then captured Mexican President Antonio de Santillana, who conceded Texas independence to save his life. So the outcome of the battle, which enabled this to happen, now to us seems inevitable. Remembering San Jacinto just isn't maybe as big a deal as remembering the Alamo, except for one group. Wherever they may be in the world, if two or more Texas Aggies can gather together on that day, they call it a muster and have a party. So this is the Aggies' day of reunion and celebration of their college days. But I sometimes wonder if they also know it is San Jacinto Day. Well, we began that one on the airways yesterday morning, and it brought me down here, so I'm delighted to be with you. And I will now present something more about East Texas specifically. Jim Crisp's charming invitation for me to participate in this conference stated that it featured grand old men and rising stars of Texas history. I'll not deny the silver in my hair confirms my category, but surely I am the single old man, since my longtime friend Felix, perhaps otherwise a designee, just keeps on keeping on and getting better all the time. It is also a pleasure to share the proceedings with Jerry and John and Andres, whose stars indeed add luster to Texas history. As for our enabler, James Crisp, he has shed more light on the mysteries of the Alamo than any other, so surely he is grand long before he is old. We will agree that Jim illuminates our path even from that great center of Texas studies in North Carolina. Jim proves beyond question that a person may leave Texas, but Texas never leaves the person. Witness the fact that he's wearing cowboy boots today. Now to my assignment. Let me tell you about the Texas Revolution in East Texas. That is simply the story of the revolution, except for that unpleasantness at Goliad and San Antonio. Virtually all the rest of the troubled colonists lived in East Texas. The region hosts two of the disturbances of 1832 and resulting conventions, consultations, and congresses. Delegates declared independence at its western extremity, and the revolution's greatest battle, and really the only one they really won, occurred right here. So this is the story of the grand old men of eastern Texas, carrying the rest of Texas on a grand adventure west and southwest to the Rio Grande and into the future as far as now. But that is getting ahead of the story. Let us go back nearer the beginning where the trouble began. Eugene C. Barker argued the inevitability of the Texas Revolution because Anglos and Mexicans sprang, he said, from such different cultural backgrounds that sufficient accommodation lay beyond their ability. While many causes contributed to the conflict, empiric evidence is difficult to ignore. Spain's legacy remained a major part of Mexico's culture, despite the creation of an independent Mexican republic in 1821. Mexicans, no less than Spaniards, were subjects of government, not citizens. They did not vote for king, viceroy, governor, or political chief. Biology determined who would be king, and the king determined the rest. The source, or at least the crown, the source and application of government power then was deductive, focused downward like an inverted pyramid upon the individual who was subject to it. Anglo-Americans sprang from a system that involved citizenship. In their tradition, governmental power inducted from people who elected representatives to various levels of public administration and who had the means to hold those officials accountable. Then, the Mexican Constitution of 1824 established a federative government similar to the Articles of Confederation adopted by Americans even during their revolution from England. In both, fundamental power remained with the people, who delegated only such power to governments necessary to provide needed service and precious little to a central Congress. Americans abandoned their articles in less than a decade because the arrangement didn't serve them well, and more bound them together than separated them than the state level of administration of power permitted. Still, many Americans, and most especially Southerners, liked the decentralization of the Federation and ensured at least the promise of its survival in the 9th and 10th Amendments to the new Constitution of the United States. When like-minded immigrants came to Texas during the 1820s, they regarded the federative states' rights Mexican government as just about the right mix of shared power between central and state governments. 2, Mexico's established church differed significantly from the plural Christianity developed during America's colonial period. So while other factors may candidate as causes for the dissatisfaction that developed by 1830 between host Mexicans and newcomer Texans, Barker's thesis cannot be dismissed. 3 episodes testify to the unease between host and newcomer. The activities of Joel Poinsett, first minister to Mexico from the United States, the Fredonia Rebellion, and the law of April 6, 1830. John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts won the presidency in 1824 over his principal opponent, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and William Crawford, in what Jackson at least regarded as a stolen election. Jackson finished first in both popular and electoral votes, but lacked the necessary majority because of the wide field of candidates. And in the House of Representatives, exercising its constitutional power to decide such issues and led by Clay, and when the House elected Adams and then Adams appointed Clay Secretary of State, Jackson and his supporters believed a corrupt bargain had cheated them out of the election. Jackson began scheming for vindication in the next election, and Adams knew he would have to have Western votes to survive a 2-man race. Enter Joel Poinsett. Adams sent Poinsett to purchase portions of Mexico, including Texas, but Poinsett failed to understand that he did not have to succeed in Mexico for Adams to do so among Western voters in the United States. So he pursued his mission zealously and disastrously. Poinsett allowed news of his mission to become public knowledge. Mexican officials who would not give serious consideration to the proposal, but as long as it remained confidential, they could ignore it quietly. Now they had to react negatively and publicly, and they could not ignore it any longer, eventually, as Felix told us this morning, declaring Poinsett persona non grata. And as he also informed us, his one contribution that was really positive was to bring home that wonderful little plant that decorates our home at Christmas. Hayden Edwards' Fredonia Rebellion intensified Mexican anxiety about the growing number of Americans in Texas and the ultimate goal of the United States towards their northern province. Edwards Grant in East Texas hosted the only significant number of previous grantees under the Spanish system, and rules for impresarios required him to honor all such grants. Few could produce hard evidence of their claims, although everyone in the Nacogdoches area knew what he owned and generally who owned the rest. Edwards posted notice on the stone house of Antonio Jalivarvo, the traditional headquarters of official business in Nacogdoches. He required landholders to produce proof of ownership or risk forfeiture. A second notice produced even greater fear and protest to the political chief in San Antonio, with whom Edwards already had poor relations. Tensions intensified then over an election for alcalde, or mayor-judge of the community. Older settlers supported Samuel Norris. Newcomers backed Chichester Chaplain, also Edwards' son-in-law. Edwards certified the election of Chaplain, but Norris's supporters protested to the political chief, and that proved one too many complaints. So that officer voided Edwards' empresarial grant. Edwards was unwilling to give it up without a fight. He declared the area of his grant free of Mexican rule and its rebirth as the Fredonia Republic. His flag, a white bar over a red bar, symbolized the union of Anglos and Cherokees, who also lived in the area. Mexican officials responded with military force. General Mateo Ahumada brought infantry and cavalry northward, and the Fredonia Republic fizzled without fight. Edwards and many of his supporters retreated to Louisiana. Others just disappeared. The real consequence of the Fredonia Rebellion was the overreaction to it. La Raza strong nationalism with xenophobia towards North Americans flourished amid fears that Poinsett and Edwards represented a Yankee plot to seize Texas. Among La Raza's leaders were General Terán, military commander of the northern provinces, and Mexican Foreign Affairs Minister Alaman. Terán ordered an investigation of Texas in the wake of the rebellion. He discovered that Americans predominated in an area surrounded by the Gulf of Mexico and the Sabine, Red, and Brazos rivers with a 10-to-1 majority, and that one Mexican more likely a hired hand than landowner. Spanish was the official language, but scarcely heard in daily discourse. Terán recommended that the government send Mexican colonists to Texas and recruit European colonists to interrupt Anglo solidarity, restrict trade between Texas and the United States more vigorously, station troops in Texas, and Mexican President Vicente Guerrero decreed slavery abolished throughout Mexico in 1829. Since only the Texans had the chattel slavery he intended, all of Mexico meant Texas exclusively. Not every Texan owned slaves, but most believed in that system, so the majority took offense, but not as much as to the Law of April 6, 1830. The Law of April 6, 1830 followed Terán's recommendations closely. It forbade further colonization in Texas by U.S. citizens, and those already in Texas would not be permitted to obtain land grants. Mexicans would be sent as colonists. European colonization encouraged. Customs collectors were stationed in Texas to direct trade towards Mexico, and investigators would monitor affairs. Such severe measures testified to concern that a crisis of authority existed. Texans also resented the threat of Mexican immigrants, some of them convicts. They resented the imposition of customs, although they were on less firm ground since it was within the power of the government, and also because they had known from all along that customs collections would begin 7 years after immigration. So the Law of April 6, intended to deal with a crisis that did not then exist, was the precipitant of a crisis. Trouble came in 1830. Terán's soldiers arrived, Texans believed, not to protect, but to police. Colonel Juan Davis Bradburn, headquartered in Anahuac with approximately 150 men. Colonel Domingo de Ugartequia had another 100 in Velasco, and Colonel Jose de la Piedras commanded a similar garrison in Nacogdoches. Like the arrival of redcoats in Boston in the 1770s, the presence of troops in Texas was provocative even before an offensive act occurred. The governor of Coahuila challenged the central, which is this one, the government of Coahuila challenged the central government's ban on immigration by asserting the constitutional power of the state in such matters and directed local officials to resume granting land to bona fide applicants. Terán prohibited state officials from doing so, and the first incident occurred when Bradburn marched to the new community of Liberty, abolished it, and arrested the state land commissioner. When settlers complained, Bradburn closed all coastal ports except Anahuac. Bradburn's actions drew protests, particularly in a meeting in Brazoria, so he reopened the ports, but tension ignited with the arrest of William Barrett Travis and his partner Patrick Jack. Jack's brother, William, when that occurred, hurried to San Felipe for help, and history turned on the absence of Stephen F. Austin from headquarters. Austin likely would have gone alone to Anahuac to reason with Bradburn. Instead, armed men made the journey. They encamped on the upper end of Galveston Bay on Turtle Bayou as word spread of the arrest of the Americans. They adopted the Turtle Bayou Resolutions, a statement of continued loyalty to Mexico under its constitution, but they wanted Travis and Jack released immediately. Negotiations failed, and events intensified feelings. The Texans captured one of Bradburn's patrols and proposed an exchange, then lost their advantage when they released their prisoners and Bradburn did not. Next, John Austin led a group to Velasco to seize a cannon to fire on the Mexican camp at Anahuac. And most importantly, Colonel Piedras arrived from Nacogdoches to investigate. Piedras stopped by the insurgents' camp on his way to Anahuac, and there learned their side of the argument as well as their firepower. Not persuaded, he realized that firepower was on their side. In Anahuac, Piedras relieved Bradburn of command and gave him a day's head start out of town. Then he released Travis and Jack to civil authorities for a trial that he and they knew would never occur. John Austin captured the cannon at Velasco, but had to shoot his way down the river, firing the first shots, really, of the Texas Revolution. Piedras returned to Nacogdoches, where he precipitated the third and final disturbance of 1832, all in East Texas, you'll note, when he ordered settlers in his jurisdiction to surrender their guns. And you can imagine, I can just see Charlton Heston, with his hands around that rifle. "From my cold, dead fingers," he would say. Piedras wanted to prevent a repetition of the trouble of Anahuac, and instead he produced it. The firearms he knew could be used as weapons of war were also tools of the hunt for the Texans, who depended on game for food. Although they had left the constitutional right to bear arms in the United States when they became Mexican citizens, obviously they had not intended to surrender that right. So when they brought guns to Nacogdoches, it was not to surrender them. Most of the participants of the Battle of Nacogdoches lived in the Ayish Bayou, or near San Augustine. They arrived at the home of Adolphus Stern on the eastern edge of Nacogdoches, or El Camino Real, and Stern showed them how to move north along La Nana Bayou, cut west behind the Stone House and the Red House, both occupied by Piedras' garrison. A few residents of Nacogdoches joined the fight, which lasted then into the evening. Covered by dark, Piedras attempted to lead his men to safety, but they were caught at the Angelina River, and a second battle developed. Piedras then surrendered and was conducted under guard to San Antonio. The disturbances of 1832 at Anahuac, Velasco, and Nacogdoches launched the movement for independence, although few Texans thought so at the time. To them, these clashes represented support for the states' rights constitution of 1824 and opposition only to centrist usurpers of power, in their view. To the centrists, the disturbances represented a threat to authority. Since the Fredonia Rebellion, the La Raza group regarded any opposition in Texas as a plot to seize the area for the United States. The cultural clash continued, and the disturbances led to the conventions of 1832 and 1833, and even more misunderstanding. Historians have argued that the Texas Revolution was a continuation of the American Revolution transferred to the Southwest. There are several similarities. Both developed in locations far from central government. Both occurred after a period of salutary neglect, and both resulted from central government attempts to reassert authority. T.R. Fehrenbach has pointed out the differences as well. English colonists came to America with constitutional principles still forming. Americans arrived in Mexican Texas with them more or less intact and institutionalized in the Constitution of the United States, especially in their states' rights beliefs of it. And while English colonists came to an undeveloped area, Americans moved to a Texas with long-established Hispanic religious, legal, and cultural customs. And the disturbance of 1832 occurred at a time when Mexico itself was in turmoil. In January 1832, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna raised the grito of revolution. Santa Anna called for the restoration of the Constitution of 1824, although subsequent events proved him insincere. Once successful, he centralized himself in power. Okra Jones called Santa Anna a political chameleon, or one who appeared to be monarchist, republican, empiricist, or states' righter, whatever benefited his goal of personal power. When Texans learned of Santa Anna's call for the restoration of states' rights, they declared their support. Austin convinced even Colonel Jose Antonio Mejia, Santa Anna's lieutenant in the North, that advocacy of the Constitution of 1824 had been the motivation of the disturbances. That was truthful. The problem was that Santa Anna was not sincere about states' rights. At this stage, the Texas Revolution had yet to take on the ethnic proportions that resulted from events in 1836 at the Alamo and Goliad. So far, a genuine division over centricism versus states' rights was the issue, with many Tejanos and Anglos on the same side. The Ayuntamiento of San Felipe called a convention for October 1832 to draft statements of explanation and petition for changes in the governance of Texas. They asked the government to convey land titles again and for more local governments, continued exemption from customs, repeal of the law of April 6, and separate statehood. Their petition was returned by the political chief with a reminder that they did not enjoy the rights of assembly and petition, no First Amendment. In January 1833, citizens of San Felipe called for a second convention on April the 1st. This time, a more militant spirit prevailed. Their request remained the same, but now they included a constitution for their proposed state. Clash again. This was the way it was done in the United States. Residents of a territory petitioned for statehood and offered Congress a constitution to accept or reject. Unfortunately, in Mexican opinion, as Fehrenbach observed, the first convention looked like the pronunciamiento, and the latter the plan, the second and third stages of Latin Revolution. Austin presented that petition in Mexico City, but of course made no progress. Santa Anna had retired to his hacienda near Veracruz and left administration to acting President Valentin Gomez Farias, who busied himself with reforms in church-state relationships, the army, and landowning patterns, simultaneously offending the three most conservative institutions in Mexico and giving Santa Anna the opportunity to lead what amounted to a revolution against his own government. Austin met with Santa Anna before departing for Texas. The president explained that Texas was not ready for statehood because of insufficient population and development. That was something Austin could understand. It's a carrot. It'll be there in the future. He also told Austin that he intended to send more troops to Texas for defense, presumably against Indian attack. Austin started north, but when he reached Saltillo, the capital of Coahuila y Tejas, he was arrested, returned to Mexico City, and lodged in the prison of the Inquisition. In Texas, quiet descended, like the quiet after the Boston Massacre in 1770, or on American college campuses following the tragedy at Kent State University. Uneasy, apprehensive, fearful, so quiet that Austin felt abandoned. Come summer 1835, he was allowed to return to Texas, never having been charged, tried, or cleared. The events of the Revolution accelerated in that year, 1835. In January, customs officers and soldiers returned to Anahuac. General Martin Perfecto de Cos, now commander of the Northern Territory, stationed Captain Antonio Tenorio and garrison in Anahuac to support customs collectors and to give military evidence of the central government. The presence of Tenario's men caused trouble before they had an opportunity to provoke it. A group led by J.B. Miller in San Felipe asked William Barrett Travis to lead a force to expel Tenario from Texas. This was an ad hoc adventure not countenanced by any official government. Travis was only 25 years of age, about to become 26 in August. Travis and 25 or so men traveled to Anahuac. He demanded the surrender of Mexican forces, and Tenario complied, and the next day Travis started his prisoners on the road to San Antonio and followed later. He caught the advance party in Brazoria and found them attending a 4th of July party. I've always found that pretty informative. A 4th of July party with the guests being treated, the captives being treated as guests, and his soldiers suffering condemnation. Brazoria at the moment was in the hands of the peace party, advocates who tried to minimize the damage. Condemnation of Travis was so severe that he published a card in the Texas Telegraph and Register, published in Houston, to ask people to suspend judgment until he could explain his motives. He never got the chance, of course. When Cos learned of Tenario's fate, he demanded the immediate surrender of Juliano Travis and the other outlaws for military trial, and he demanded they be surrendered to his headquarters in San Antonio. Now, that was too much for the Texans, even those who condemned Travis. William Wharton presided at a meeting at Columbia on August 15th that called for a consultation of all citizens in November to decide what course to take about the military occupation of Texas. Austin returned to Texas in late summer, as I said, and reassumed his position of leadership, at least of Anglo-Texas. What did Austin think should be done? Austin, who had made the most sincere effort of all to Hispanicize, to accommodate, to get along, who had signed his name Esteban, was now Stephen again. War is our only resource, he said on September 19th. Action does shift a bit to the west now, with Cos headquartered in San Antonio. He attempted to seize a cannon in the custody of residents of Gonzales, and others came to defend that cannon but found the work done, so they elected Austin to lead them on to San Antonio, a siege and finally a successful assault led by old Ben Milam, previously an impresario in East Texas. While these events unfolded in San Antonio, Texans met in consultation. Options considered were few: continued efforts to restore the Constitution of 1824 or separation from Mexico. Discussions failed to produce decision. Some wanted to affiliate with revolutionaries in Mexico, such as General Jose Antonio Mejia, a states writer who had broken with Santillana after the latter centralized power. Others wanted to declare independence and to be done with Mexico's evident inability to govern itself stably. In the event, their declaration of purpose reflected many policies. They attacked Santillana for violating the Constitution, called for its restoration, affirmed their belief in individual rights, but pledged to fight for independence if Mexico did not restore the states' rights constitution, and they agreed to meet again on March 1. Now action shifts westward to James Grant's futile Matamoros scheme, Santillana's assault on the Alamo, and General Jose Uria's execution of James Fannon's command in Goliad. While these events occurred, the consultation met again in March in Washington on the Brazos. The 59 delegates knew that the Alamo was under siege and the circumstance grim. George Childress produced a Declaration of Independence that resembled the model provided in 1776 by Thomas Jefferson. The first section explained and invoked the theory of revolution. The middle part indicted the Mexican nation for violating the colonists' rights. and concluding section pledged mutual effort to make their independence reality. The consultation confirmed Sam Houston as the leader of their army and continued in session until March 17 to write and adopt a constitution for the Republic of Texas. An interim president, David G. Burnett, was selected along with Lorenzo de Zavala as vice president, and Thomas Jefferson Rusk was appointed Secretary of War. All, I would remind you, were East Texans and the leaders now of this new government that they have launched. I'm not going to continue now, both in the interest of time, with the story of the Revolution, because it does shift elsewhere and into the Republic story, because my colleagues on the panel this morning and those to come have already said a great deal about it, and because I wrote everything I know about it in the little book they're selling out there called The Trail to San Jacinto. I want to conclude then by simply saying what the meaning of the place is as I perceive it this morning. If you like old movies, you may remember in Giant, Edna Ferber's story of our incarnation in the 1950s, what Texas was like. That little girl from Maryland, all ranchers' wives, I assume, looked like Elizabeth Taylor, came down, and even after her 20-year or so acclimatization, and they had that big party here at the Shamrock that where Bic Benedict hit jet drink and knocked over all the liquor bottles and so forth. And there's a despondency back home at Rieta. And the Chill Wills character was playing the organ, and he says to Leslie, Leslie, you need to get out of this place. You need to go and see all of Texas. There's an awful lot of Texas out there. And I think he's right. And I also think that it started right here. That this is the nexus, the connection from that colonial period and that revolution period to what developed all the rest of it. The Republic's experience, the war with Mexico, the addition of a quarter of our continental United States, all hinges more or less right here. I remember growing up when we had visiting relatives from out of state. I grew up in Beaumont. It's not that far. This is one of the places we wanted to show off. I remember coming here as a schoolboy on one of the excursions that you take when teachers don't want to work one day. The last time I visited here was in 1998 when John Crane, who is here somewhere, and I served on a 5-member committee to investigate the 41 historic parks under the custody of the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. I've not been back since, and I understand that I would be both saddened by what was not done out of our recommendations and perhaps encouraged by some of the things that are being done to make it better into the future. And I certainly hope that does develop. But that's sort of what it means to me, and I apologize to you partisans of San Jacinto to have to use an Alamo example to explain that. When I was a graduate student at LSU, my professor, T. Harry Williams, the very top man in Civil War studies in America in those days, had occasion, I was his graduate assistant, personally assigned to him to, flunky to grade papers and so forth and whatever else he wanted. He made the Taylor lectures over at this new thing, Jim, they're calling Texas State University, in San Marcos. And he came home and he was got me out. And I wore cowboy boots in Louisiana too, despite their discomfort. I felt it was my obligation out of state. But in any event, he wanted me to know that he had, while he was in San Marcos, had been taken to San Antonio and he had seen the Alamo. And I said, Dr. Williams, I was afraid of him. I was just absolutely frightened of him. But the one and only time I had the courage to do this, I said, Dr. Williams, did you see the back door? Oh, was there one? I said, yeah, there's one there. You've got to get out of the chapel to get to the rest of the thing. And did you see the line that Travis drew? And instantly, I had his attention. The historian took over and he said, no, where was it? And I said, right across my heart. he started waving his arms and running around his office saying, "Jesus, Jesus." But this place is right across my heart. Thank you very much.
Please welcome Andres Resendez to the lectern.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here among friends and among you all. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to James Crisp for offering this gracious invitation, and also to Barbara Eves and Dave Britton and Jeff Dunn, who have made me feel like a friend, and it's a pleasure to be here. When Jim first extended this invitation and wisely suggested that I talk a little bit about what the Texans of 1836 may have been, I didn't know at all what would I be talking, but at least I took some consolation in the fact that I had a perfect scene, like a movie scene, to begin my talk. And here I need to make a little disclaimer. To support myself when I was a graduate student and I was working away, slaving away in my dissertation, I took up a job as a consultant for historical soap operas in Mexico City. They were doing a soap opera based on the life of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, and they knew that I had been collecting some documents here and there about this, and so they sat me down with two professional script writers, and the idea is that I would feed them the information, and they would turn this into tear-jerking dialogue, and and fashion this into a soap opera. Sadly, and I won't delay too much here, they thought it was the story was a little too sordid. There was too little romance, and they pulled the plug on the project. But I thought the project was great, and one of the scenes that they really appreciated was the one that I would like to begin my talk with, and it takes place on either on the 22nd or the 23rd of April of 1836. That is exactly 170 years ago, 1 or 2 days after the Battle of San Jacinto. And what I would like to do is to read a passage to you from the memoirs of Captain Jose Antonio Menchaca, which many of you are familiar with. It is, for reasons that elude me, a little bit of an obscure source, right? The only edition that I know of was published back in the 1930s, and that's it. But it is a great source. Captain Menchaca was second in command of a detachment of Mexicans who were fighting on the side of the Texians and against the forces of Santa Anna. For those of you who know a great deal about San Jacinto, and I know there are many of you here, you will notice that some of the data is wrong. And the reason is that he actually dictated his memoirs perhaps 40 years after the fact. So some of the details are wrong, and perhaps this accounts for the fact that many historians have decided that this is just way too inaccurate, and they haven't used that. But for me, Captain Menchaca's memoirs captures the emotions and the situation better than any other source that I can think of that aftermath of that battle. And this is what he had to say. And forgive me for a second, it's a little extended, but it is worth, I think, mentioning. And as I said, think of it as if you were watching a Mexican soap opera as I go through here. Here's what he had to say. Quote, "On the second day after the action at San Jacinto, 2 young gentlemen volunteers in the Texas service, one named Lewis Robinson and another Pitt from New Orleans," so you can see that the names are wrong, but anyways, I'm sorry, rode out 2 miles from our camp and scouted. They were looking out for prisoners. One of them spied a fine-looking man with a commanding personal appearance, dressed, however, in a very filthy, ragged suit with a blue cap, having a leather front piece. He was sitting down on the ground at a little distance from 2 likely-looking young mulatto women who were parching corn to feed him, and who evidently were his mistresses. The young men rode up to the party and asked the mulatto who that man was. They answered confusedly and told him to ask him. They did so, and he said, "I am Carlo, General Santa Anna's private secretary." They told him he was a liar, that Carlo was a prisoner at that moment in General Sam Houston's camp. Then they told him to get up and follow them, and that they did not care who he was, for they intended to take him into the camp to their general. And so the three, there are some altercation here, but after one more passage, the three rode into camp, and when they rode in, one of the Mexicans who knew the prisoner said, "There it is, General Santa Anna." And the news seemed to spread over the army as if by electricity. And the whole army cheered up the two young men and their distinguished prize. They rode up near General Houston's tent and dismounted, and Santa Anna took a seat on a trunk and crossed his legs and kept his sharp bright eyes occupied in watching the army, who crowded up close all around him in a circle. And those in the rear got up on the shoulders of the men in front of them to get a look at Santa Anna, who sat like a lion at bay. He sat thus silently for some time, and his eyes seemed every now and then to single out the officers. Finally, he said, "I am very thirsty. Will not someone bring me some water?" And here's the interesting part. He made the Masonic sign of distress. As he did so, all the officers and men of that fraternity drew their weapons and closed around him, General Houston among the rest, to protect him. Just at this juncture, General Somerville, who was not a Mason and was just beyond the circle of men around Santa Anna, came up cursing and swearing that he was going to kill Santa Anna, and he had a bowie knife in one hand and a pistol in the other. Houston said to Somerville, "Your blood is too warm. Go down to the bayou and take a bath, and that will cool it off." Somerville answered, "I don't care what you say. I intend to kill him," and became still more excited. Houston then told General Rusk, who stood behind him, to go and take Somerville away and make him promise not to harm their prisoner, and if he did not, to kill him on the spot. So he was not joking. Santa Anna then drew a long sigh of relief as Somerville was led off, and said after a short pause, "Is there not someone who speaks Castilian and English?" He asked this question in Spanish, and Houston's own interpreter answered him in the same tongue, and then, "I said," says Captain Menchaca, "I do." End of quote. So, sorry, again, apologies for the lengthy introduction. This is the way Captain Menchaca describes himself into perhaps the most dramatic episode of the history of Texas. Now, for the sake of those skeptics here, I should say that there is no doubt that Captain Menchaca was where he said he was. He received donation certificate number 31 for 640 acres of land for having participated in the Battle of San Jacinto. There are other corroborating documents. He was issued a bounty certificate. He received an appointment as captain of cavalry, which was confirmed by the Senate of the Republic of Texas. So there is clear documentation that he was there, and that what he was describing was more or less accurate in spite of some problems with some of the data, some of the little details there. Now, the passage above has many interesting angles and quite a bit of drama, but two themes stand above the others, I think. First, it shows that there were many ethnic Mexicans fighting on the Texan side. There were many ethnic Mexicans actually fighting on behalf of Texas, even at this late stage when Texas was clearly on the path to secession from Mexico, and they were fighting their fellow Mexicans. So the battle, and this is old hat from what I've been able to gather. I mean, 2 decades ago, this would have been cast more as a battle between Mexicans and Anglo-Americans, or between white and non-white, etc. Now it's a different time, and we sort of celebrate Texas' multicultural roots, and so nobody gives a second thought about the fact that really what we're dealing with is a coalition of Anglo-Americans, Mexicans, and Indians fighting against Mexico's government bent on greater centralization. This is the essence of the story. So, however tempting it may be to brush aside these little details and the fact that there were Mexicans, as I will try to argue, by brushing aside these details, we're missing the very essence of this struggle. So that is one theme, and I won't dwell too much on that. The second interesting detail in Captain Menchaca's passage, of course, the enormous power of Freemasonry. And here again, Captain Menchaca has sterling credentials, as he was a member of the Holland Lodge, which is the oldest chapter of the Masonic Order in San Antonio. And now I should say something about the sources here. I grew up in Mexico, as Jim was saying, if you know anything about Mexican history, everybody will tell you that everybody who was somebody in Mexico back in the 1820s and 30s was a Mason. And yet, there's no way to investigate this because the Masonic archives are closed. They either have been destroyed, or there's no way to access them, or at least I've tried, and some other historians have tried, and there's no way to access them. Texas is the exception to this, because we have especially one work a Mason historian who got access to all of these records, and James D. Carter is the name, and he actually published a wealth of information on the workings of Freemasonry in Texas, including lists of all the lodges and who belonged to these lodges, etc. And the reason I want to give a little bit of a story, take up the story here, is because I believe that Freemasonry is one of the principal institutions, not the only one, but one of the principal ones that enabled this inter-ethnic coalition that I was talking to you just a second ago. In other words, if we set aside the secrecy associated with Masonic lodges, we can say that these were just social gatherings that brought Anglo-Americans and Mexicans and Indians, there were Indian Masons as well, together to discuss politics, and that this created an avenue where these ideas were exchanged and where these alliances were made. Okay, so in order for us to understand how, in these most dramatic circumstances, right, when the Texian troops actually captured Santa Ana, it is only by looking at this little history that we can begin to understand how is it that these Freemasons closed around Santa Ana, and against their own ethnic sympathies and their own impulse for revenge, they actually ended up protecting him rather than letting Somerville or some other individual kill Santana on the spot. So what I would like to do in the next few minutes is to tell you a little bit about how this scene could be possible. First of all, and so I have to say, first of all, that Freemasonry is a rather interesting and recent phenomenon in Mexico. There are some little tidbits about Freemasonry back in the early 18th century in Mexico, but really the big source, the sources really tell us that it began only when Mexico became independent from Spain in the 1810s. Mexicans were first exposed to Masonic organizations in Spain when various Mexican representatives made their way to Spain because of the French invasion. I mean, there's a little bit of background here. As many of you know, the constitutional crisis was brought about because French troops invaded Spain in 1808. And various representatives from various regions of Spain actually gathered in and around Cadiz, which was an area protected by British cannons, essentially, and they convened a grand gathering to discuss what to do, and they brought representatives from all over the Spanish Empire, including all over Mexico. many of the Mexican representatives went there, and this is for the first time that they were exposed to this Masonic form of organization. And once they came back, they went back to Mexico, they started organizing in their own right. And this is this type of Freemasonry was the that Professor Felix Almaraz had told us a little bit about in the morning. It's the Scottish Rite Masonry, or Escoceses as they were known in Mexico. And they were very important for a little bit of time. They were highly organized, and they lived a brief heyday in 1823-24, which is a critical period because this is when the time when the Constitution of 1824, the liberal constitution under which Texas lived, was crafted. And that Congress that yielded that first constitution was dominated by the Escoceses. It is also important because the main figure of the Scottish Rite Masons turned out to be a clergyman, just to confuse things even more, a bespectacled clergyman who actually lived in Coahuila, from Coahuila. And as you know, in 1824, the Mexican state of Coahuila and Texas were amalgamated into one gigantic state, the state of Coahuila and Texas. And so from that perspective, the leader of the Scottish Rite Masonry actually happened to be a power broker in this big entity. Scottish Rite Masons in Mexico soon found themselves outflanked by a second Masonic group, founded in Mexico City, possibly in the summer of 1825, although there are some other references that put them a little earlier than that. But the most accepted interpretation is that they began that year. They were more radical than the Scottish Rite Masons. And that year, Joel R. Poinsett, again mentioned a couple of times in the course of this day, who was the first United States ambassador in Mexico, either offered or was asked to incorporate the newly formed society into the Rite of York, obtaining the regulating patents from the Grand Lodge of New York. You see, in Mexico, there was no organized lodge that had regular patents, and so this had to be done. So maybe the animosity of Mexicans against Poinsett for this particular issue is overblown, because he may have simply been doing a favor that the Mexican, York Rite Masons were themselves asking the ambassador. Their boldness earned them the names of radicals, federalists, or simply Yorquinos. So Escoceses and Yorquinos. What's most interesting about this second Masonic group is that it evinced an incredible cosmopolitanism from the very beginning. That is, Mexican Yorquinos had interactions with lodges in the United States and drew support from influential foreigners living in and around Mexico. If you take a look at this book by James D. Carter, you will see that many of the lodges established in various parts of Mexico, and specifically in Texas, actually got their charters from other lodges in the United States, in, say, New Orleans or in Tennessee or places like that. So you can begin to see the alliances being formed in terms of these supranational organization. Now, thus far I have talked about both brands of Freemasonry as it played out in Mexico, but they also, both brands of Freemasonry had a tremendous influence on Texas. The Escoceses, the Scottish Rite Masons, had the upper hand in Texas in the decisive period when the political institutions were being established. That is in 23, 24, 25, 26. And what I mean by that is the legislature of the gigantic state of Coahuila and Texas, which was at the epicenter of the political revolution taking place in Texas, was completely dominated by the 12-member legislature, was completely dominated by Scottish Rite Masons. These were the people who actually drafted the colonization law of 1825, which is a very liberal colonization law, and I will, with some incredible developments, and I'll say a few words about that. And they are also responsible for the creation of the Constitution of Coahuila and Texas of 1826. Interestingly enough, the colonization law preceded the Constitution because they were in such a rush and so interested in Texas land. So in essence, the way land would be parceled out in Texas was as the governor and 2 or 3 state legislature, after secretive or not so secretive deliberations, they started to confer princely land grants, colonization enterprises, exclusive rights to navigate Texas rivers, and made profitable appointments of Texas customs and lands officials. And so since this machine was in the hands of Escoceses at first, it is not surprising to find some of the largest grants going to Escoceses. But, so beginning in 1825, Mexicans, Anglo-American, French, and British land speculators, settlers, empresarios, merchants, etc., gravitated toward the state legislature, which was located in the town of Saltillo. And in this world prone to the wholesale trafficking of political influence and economic favors, Masonic lodges provided a ready-made network of personal contacts and tacit alliances. Let me give you a few examples. As state legislatures discussed the final drafts of the state colonization law early in 1825, numerous land developers swarmed into Saltillo. Saltillo may have been a dusty town in the middle of nowhere, but it was the very center of power in this enormous area. The most successful land developers turned out to be Masons in these months. The list of Anglo-American Freemason empresarios includes Robert Lefwich, Frost H. Thorne, David G. Burnett, John Cameron, Benjamin R. Millam, Hayden Edwards, and James Power. Many of these characters mentioned in the morning sessions, and even Archie also mentioned some of them. The list, of course, would not be complete without Stephen F. Austin of the Louisiana number 109 Lodge. But of course, this is only one side of the story. Anglo-American Masons were only one side of the story. Also, Mexican Masons were able to secure empresario contracts or 11 league grants. The list was topped by none other by that bespectacled clergyman that I told you about, Miguel Ramos Arizpe, the national leader of the Scottish Rite Masons. He received an enormous colonization contract running along the northern margin of the Rio Grande in an irregular quadrangle comprising between 800 and 1,000 square leagues, or over 4 million acres, according to his own estimates. But that was a brief heyday, as I said, and in Texas what happened is that in the elections of 1827 and in the elections of 1829, the Scottish Rite Masons were ousted from the legislature and were replaced by Yorkino majorities. And so the land granting machinery came to be controlled by the Yorkinos. And so the most successful empresarios ultimately turned out to be Yorkinos. The prime example of this are the Viesca brothers, Agustin and Jose Maria, who had been among the founding members of the Yorkino Lodge back in 1825 that I told you about in Mexico City in the summer. They were in that meeting that founded the Yorkino Lodge in Mexico, and possibly were the ones who actually asked Joel R. Poinsett to incorporate this to the Lodge of New York. There were indeed throughout Mexico the most important Yorkino leaders found themselves having some interest, landed interest in Texas. I mean, there are several examples, but I could give you, for example, the Grand Secretary of the Grand Lodge of Mexico, that is the top official in the Yorkino lodges, Colonel Jose Antonio Mejia, also mentioned by Archie. He acquired an 11-league grant. Among others was the Vice President of Mexico, Valentin Gomez Farias, and the finance minister of Mexico and future vice president of the Texas Republic, Lorenzo de Zavala. Lorenzo de Zavala had also been, along with the Viesca brothers, founders of the Yorkino lodges back in 1825. So the point that I'm trying to tell here is that Texas was a remarkable experiment. It was like a safety valve for Mexican politicians. That is that, you know, whenever things would turn bad in Mexico politically, this was a haven that they could always flee to, you know, in these adverse moments. And so everybody who was somebody in the Yorkino world had some sort of a foothold in Texas. And of course, again, you can see the tangle of alliances leading from Mexico City through Saltillo to the various colonization enterprises in Texas, and also with power brokers in these lodges in and around New Orleans, Louisiana, et cetera, and beyond in the US. Okay? So the point that I'm trying to make is quite clear. If we believe in my book, Changing National Identities, I wrote that perhaps 10% or less were Masons in Texas who were living at the time in the 1830s. I think my estimate was quite wrong. The number is probably closer to 1 or 2% of, you know, Masons at large. But over 50% of those who received land, in Texas, were Masons. So this was no coincidence whatsoever. This was the network as it existed back then. So in the absence of a constituted nation, right, I mean, there were few other mechanisms that brought Mexicans and Americans together, or Mexicans and Anglo-Americans together. This network, this land and this ideology and these personal connections were very intimately intertwined, and this is what lubricated, what made this world possible. It is also important to note that, and this is the curse of being the last, I don't want to go on forever, I want to be brief and to the point. But just want to say one more thing, and that is that land was rather more than land in Texas. Land came intertwined with politics, especially liberal ideals. And again, this is another reason why, if you were the Viesca brothers, or if you were Mexican liberals trying to develop Mexico, you would actually favor Masons for giving them grants rather than any other people. Liberalism in the second decade of the 19th century was on the rise worldwide. Religious and institutional strictures of the past were being cast aside in favor of a new system of freedoms aimed at unleashing the full potential of the human spirit, particularly in the pursuit of economic endeavors. And so the colonization commissioner for Texas and the former Mexican consul in Bordeaux, Tadeo Ortiz, for example, wrote to the Mexican president in 1833, explaining that since the French Revolution, Europe had been working relentlessly to abolish all obstacles to the expansion of industry, accumulation of wealth, and commerce. And above all, the commissioner explained, the United States furnished indisputable evidence of the validity of these new political doctrines by bringing hard-working settlers, allowing trade to flourish, and promoting industry. The young republic to the north, the United States, had become a sprawling and prosperous entity, a wunderkind nation. It was now Mexico's turn to follow suit, and Texas, with her convenient ports, her proximity to the American markets, and her enormous vacant lands or baldios, was well poised for just that feat. And so the colonization experiment in Texas became a crucial test and an ideological battleground of the virtues of liberalism. The hopes of liberals throughout Mexico rode on the success of the Texas colonization experiment. Now, this colonization experiment was initially supported by the national leadership in Mexico, as you all know, including Santa Anna. Now, I know Santa Anna gets a very bad press in this corner of the world, but he began as a liberal himself. Like virtually all prominent Mexican politicians of the time, he had been involved with the Masonic lodges in Mexico, And even though his affiliation is a little murky, we know that his brother, for example, was the publisher of El Mercurio, which was the mouthpiece of the Yorquinos. So we know that he had some affiliation with the Yorquino lodges at first. There's also some evidence that he also had joined, previous to that, the Escoceses. So again, Don Felix mentioned that he was unencumbered by ideological by politics. So he obviously joined everything and obviously knew all the distress signs from everybody. So he could always use them at the right time, as he did. But as the 1820s went on, some Mexican leaders became a little concerned about this liberal experiment, and especially about the vast demographic changes taking place in Texas, as hundreds and sometimes more than 1,000 a year of Anglo-American colonists came to Texas and essentially dwarfing the Mexican population already living here. So this is the background. I don't want to go on. I would rather engage in a give and take, but this is the background that helps us understand Captain Jose Antonio Menchaca's memoirs. And through the lens of this impressive network of Masonic lodges, landed interest, and theology, we can begin to understand why the alliance between Anglo-Americans, Mexicans, and Indians held together at the time of the Battle of San Jacinto. To be sure, this alliance was severely tested with the military clashes between Mexicans and Americans. To gain popular support, Mexican centralists shrewdly portrayed the conflict in Texas as a national crusade against a legion of ungrateful Anglo-American adventurers who were conniving with a few local authorities to steal a most precious part of the national territory. Similarly, Anglo-American volunteers streaming to Texas had little knowledge of the complex patronage tying Anglo-American colonists and Mexicans, and naturally tended to view the conflict in more simple ethnic terms, Mexicans against Anglo-Americans. So how justified were the high-sounding epithets of traitors or ungrateful employed by centralist leaders to describe Mexican Texans like Captain Menchaca, who acquiesced to separation from Mexico? The centralist rhetoric emphasized collective identities based on religion, or linguistic and ethnic solidarity, or merely pointed to the fact that Texas had been an administrative unit of New Spain and Mexico for more than 100 years. And yet, the experience of the likes of Captain Menchaca demonstrates that below these collective identities, there were deep-running political and ideological convictions, as well as pecuniary interests, which were also central in determining people's loyalties, and ultimately their national identity. As much as Mexican Texans were reluctant to forsake their old collective definitions, they were also well adapted to the rough frontier environment, where the safeguard of one's interest and sheer survival had shaped life for generations. The end of the Texas Revolution did not settle once and for all the identity struggles of these Mexican Texans. Shifting economic conditions and political instability, both in Mexico and in the newly created Republic of Texas, continued to plague them for several years, most notably during the two Mexican military occupations of San Antonio in 1842 and in the controversy over the annexation of Texas to the U.S. But for these Mexican Texans, the fundamental tensions between their origins, traditions, and culture on the one hand, and the preservation of their interests on the other, continued throughout their lives. Thank you very much.